Good evening, everybody. It is such a pleasure to see everyone once again here in our illustrious Zoom room, our illustrious digital offerings. Welcome back to the Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis. It's so good to see you all here once again. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for participating. So just a quick public service announcement before we get rolling with tonight's agenda. And that is, we had mentioned last week that our hope and our plan is to bring back our in-person learning program any day now. We are in the works of figuring out a temporary location because the Federation won't be available till the fall. And I mentioned last week that the plan is that this session will move to Wednesday nights. And we did get a few messages, a few comments from some regulars that Wednesday nights are really not good for them. Can we look at another night? And I just want to say that we did look extensively at our schedule, seeing if it must be a Wednesday or not. And that is really the only day of the week that it looks like it's going to work when we take into several other considerations for either standing commitments or monthly or bi-monthly commitments. But please, again, I want to say one more time, if everyone can give us their feedback. I know those of you who already have, thank you, and it has been taken into consideration. But if Wednesday nights are not going to be good for you, please let us know so we do have that information before we officially make that call. And then, if need be, we'll see how we can reassess some other things and move things around. But as of now, it is looking like Wednesday is the most likely evening for it to work with many other considerations. So just a quick public service announcement, and with no further ado, we will jump right into tonight's subject matter. Let me give everyone the outline there who's interested in following along. It's going to be showing up here in your chat box momentarily. 1 second here, let me get the link. Okay, this is the outline right here. There you have it in the chat box. And along those lines, this is it's the family tree of King David, which will play into tonight's session as well as to many subsequent sessions. So anyone who's interested in that, there it is in your chat box. And now that you have everything you need, I have seemingly everything I need, I hope, and we are ready to get rolling. So last week, we wrapped up with the family, essentially, the nation, or the transition from family to nation starting to take shape. We had Jacob and his 4 wives all stationed in Haran by the family of Lavan, the tricky father-in-law of Jacob. And we have 13 children at this point. We have 12 children at this point. Benjamin has not been born yet. I think we did discuss his birth towards the end of last week. So I guess we do have all 13. On Jacob's way back to Israel to reunite with his family, to reunite with his father, he has his first great confrontation with Esau. And the confrontation actually goes well, but in many ways, that confrontation is looked at as the blueprint for every time we have to interact with the world of Esau throughout history. And so much so that in the days of the Roman Empire, which existed for quite a long time, it really did. Again, not in its glory and not its glory years, but I believe actually today in Jewish history is the anniversary of when the Roman Empire was finally came to an end. But be it as it may, when Jewish emissaries, rabbis, and community activists and the like had to interact with the Roman government, they would often study the section of Jacob's interaction with Esau that at this point, when Jacob's on his way back from Haran to reunite with his family, and use that as a blueprint. Because we see that Jacob prepared in 3 ways. He prepared, number 1, militarily. He took whatever military needs and considerations into account in the event that he would have had to go to war with Esau at that point. He tried to essentially bribe Esau. He sent a tribute. He sent financial gifts. And the third is he prayed. He prayed to Hashem. He davened that he should be successful in his interaction with Esau. And in his fateful, famous words, he davens that he should be saved. He says, "Hatzileni na me'achi me'esav," that I should be saved from my brother from Esav. And which our sages point out, the double language, that he prayed not only to be saved from Esau, but from his brother and from Esau. And what exactly does that mean? Well, one of the understandings there is quite often throughout history in our interactions with Esau and the spiritual descendants of Esau, sometimes they appear like Esau, sometimes they appear like an out-and-out enemy, but sometimes they appear like Achi, like our brother. And oftentimes we don't know the difference, if Esau is acting like our enemy or our friend, and which one is he? And both of them, quite often, we have to be equally saved from. So that was the prayer that Jacob put forth. Save me, please, from my brother, from Esav, whether he's appearing as my brother, whether he's appearing as my enemy. Regardless, we know at the core that Esav's ultimate goal is to wipe out Jacob and the Jewish people, for that matter. So that's where we essentially ended off last week. We have Jacob who reunites with his father, with Yitzchak. And we have a situation where it seems like Jacob can finally enjoy his life, right? He's got his family's starting to have kids themselves. He becomes a Zaidi. He, it looks like maybe he'll get some tranquility in his life, but in many ways, the joke is on him, because just when he thought he would get some tranquility, things get turned upside down. Now, I want to circle back to something we said in our discussion of Abraham, because I think it's a very important blueprint, not only for tonight, but really in many ways for all of Jewish history. And that is that we had discussed that when Avraham signed up, so to speak, to be the progenitor of the Jewish people, the Almighty made with him what we call the covenant between the parts, the bris bein habesarim. And he said in that covenant a fateful statement of Yedua Teda, Abraham, this is God speaking to Abraham, you should surely know, Ki ger yeh zarecha be'eretz lo lahem, that your descendants are going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. And they're going to be enslaved and afflicted for 400 years. And the way that the best understanding of this that I have received was from Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, and this is the idea we shared in our previous lecture on Abraham, that the directive, so to speak, was that in order for Abraham to become the progenitor of the Jewish people and be the light unto the nations and be the spreader of monotheism that he was set out to become, he had to really first go through what our sages refer to as the Kor HaBarzel, the refining oven. And part of that process of going through the refining oven was appreciating what it meant to be a stranger, would appreciate what it meant to be afflicted, to be oppressed, to be downtrodden, to not be, have the top of your game. So the Almighty says to Abraham, in order for you to make the Jewish people, I need 400 years. Meaning, at that time, it's about 6 generations because of the lifespan of these people, of our patriarchs. But that was necessary for our spiritual DNA as the Jewish people to be able to be the people that we need to become. In other words, we needed to truly understand what it meant to be strangers. We needed to truly understand what it meant to be out of place. And the way that we understand this is, since the directive was to begin with the descendants of Abraham, it begins with the birth of Isaac and it goes through till the Exodus. And that's exactly 400 years. So mathematically it fits beautifully, but conceptually it also fits, because we see that Isaac, even though he never leaves the land of Israel, or what we now call the land of Israel, wasn't called the land of Israel yet, but his whole entire lifetime, even though it was in the land, he was a stranger, right? He did not have any sort of sovereignty. The Canaanite nations were still powerful. He had negative interactions with those Canaanites, and he was clearly a stranger in that land. But now with Jacob, and more specifically the sons of Jacob, now they're starting to spread out a little bit. They're starting to get a little comfortable. We have certain situations where we see they assert their strength. One of the most notable of that was the interaction with the nation of Shechem, who was living in the present-day land of Israel, where there is an atrocity committed against Dinah, their sister. And the way that they are, so to speak, paid back for the atrocity is Shimon and Levi, son number 2 and son number 3, conspire to and essentially wipe out the whole tribe of Shechem. And all this is trying to show, like, okay, if you're wiping out people who as terrible as it was what happened to Dina, but if you're starting to wipe out people who are messing with you, that's not a stranger, right? Strangers don't wipe out those who mess with them. That just doesn't happen. So it was events like that and other events that our sages tell us. In fact, our sages tell us that the battle with Shechem, that's what the Torah tells us about, but that spawned all kinds of other battles from other neighboring tribes that were allied with Shechem, and Shimon and Levi were able to take them on, and the brothers were able to take them on, and they were successful in all these battles. And long story short, this was a big play into this peace that they weren't acting like strangers anymore. They were acting like they were in charge of the place. So the Almighty says, 400 years, if you want to be the people you're going to become, if we're going to build the Jewish people as we need to build them, it needs to be 400 complete years. So now enter stage left, so to speak, is our situation with Yosef, and which really sets the stage for the next chapter of those 400 years. Now, the story of Joseph is, as my Rosh Yeshiva, Rosh Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg, Zechron Levracha, would often say, that the Torah is either absolutely divine or was written by one of the biggest anti-Semites on the map of world history, because, all our dirty laundry is aired out in the Chumash, in the Bible. We tell everything positive, we tell everything negative, sometimes exacerbating the negative more than the positive. And this discussion of Joseph and the brothers is no exception at all. Now, even though it did make a great soap opera / musical, at least according to Andrew Lloyd Webber, it begs an explanation, because on the surface, if we just simply read the Chumash and look at the story, it doesn't add up very well. These people are what we call the Shiftei Kod. These are the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they are, they're regarded as completely righteous individuals. And therefore, if they do the actions, so to speak, of what plays out in the story and their interaction with Joseph, there has to be a justification. Either there's a justification or we're fine saying some seemingly petty people are again, we don't call them our forefathers at this point, but the heads of our tribes, the heads of the tribes of the Jewish people. So how are we to understand it? So first of all, just the surface story, just to review it. I'm sure we all know it at some level. Either we saw the musical or remember it from Sunday school. But be it as it may, you have Joseph, who is the older of the two brothers from Rachel. And it was Rachel had two sons. One is Joseph, the older. The second is Benjamin. And Joseph is clearly the favored by his father. He gets an amazing Technicolor dream coat, or as we call it in the Chumash, a Ksonas Pasim, a wool tunic of many colors, a sign of seeming favoritism from Jacob. And the brothers become jealous. And if the tunic wasn't enough to cause jealousy, fancy clothing always causes jealousy. But if that wasn't enough to cause jealousy, the next thing that happens is Joseph starts having dreams about how his father's going to bow down to him, and his brothers are all going to bow down to him, and like he sees himself as the head of the family. And with what seems to be a complete lack of seichel, he goes on to actually tell his brothers about this dream and tell his father about this dream. That, by the way, guys, and again, remember, he's wearing this fancy jacket that they're jealous of. He says, guys, I had a dream last night that, you were going to be bowing down to me one day. What do you think about that? So needless to say, this doesn't help the situation, the relationship between Joseph and his brothers. The brothers eventually get fed up. Now, to make matters even a little worse, or probably a lot worse, is we're told that the brothers, when they were off working in the fields and doing the different things that they did, that Joseph was basically the, for lack of a better word, the spy of his father. In other words, he would be the one who would communicate back to Jacob what his brothers were up to. And quite often what Joseph would find and report back to his father appeared to be no good, right? They're up to no good. Again, our sages deal with this and what he saw, what actually was happening, but that definitely didn't help the situation. So we just have a terrible situation of sibling rivalry, of Joseph being the favored, treated as the favored, Jacob just seeming to completely be oblivious to the residual effect of that, and the brothers saying, like, enough is enough, we're going to do something. So what do you do to a situation of, when you're jealous of your younger brother who's treated better by your father? What do? Obviously, you kill the guy, right? That's what any one of us would do, right? Absolutely not. Yet for some reason, like, we're okay with the fact that the founders of our 12 tribes, that this is what they did. like, big question mark at the very least. That they, the way they decide they're going to deal with Joseph is kill him. Now, when push comes to shove, he comes, they take him, they throw him in the pit that itself should have, could have, would have killed him. It was full of, our sages tell us, scorpions and snakes, which, for any of you who saw Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know how scary that can be. And but just like, by Indiana Jones, Joseph was miraculously saved from the snakes and scorpions. God made a miracle and they didn't bother him. But then they decide, okay, if he's not going to die in the pit, why should we get our hands dirty further than we have already? Let's just sell him into slavery and get rid of him. And then, Shalom al Yisrael, we'll be good. Again, like, I don't care how bad the sibling rivalry is. And, I'm a rabbi. I've seen some bad sibling rivalry in my day. I'm sure we all have our stories. Not me, because I was the favorite of my children, of my parents. So don't tell anyone, don't tell my siblings, but you can ask them about it. And, it can be rough, but selling into slavery, not quite ever that bad. So how are we to even make sense of the story, of the situation here that is part of our foundation? Again, like I said, either this is true or is written by the world's biggest anti-Semite, because it doesn't make us look too good. By the way, Lahavdil, speaking about, not that this man is an anti-Semite, I don't actually know him personally, but he definitely is not a biblical authenticist. But the writer, I'm blanking on his name now, Dawking, wrote a book called, wrote a book on why he feels the Bible's not true and there's not a God. I'm blanking on the name of the book, but in it, this is one of his complaints, that like all the forefathers are petty, and and that's why he writes it all off. Okay, but he didn't see our sages. He didn't see what the Talmud said. He didn't see what the Midrashim said to explain this. So let's take a big step back. That's the story. Now let's take a step back and try to understand this story and try to understand what's going on. First of all, our sages are critical of Jacob for how he treated Joseph, because he clearly miscalculated some things. But what did he miscalculate? What did he even have in mind? Is it just that Joseph was from his wife, who was the favorite of his wife, so now he becomes a favorite son and gets a fancy coat? No, it's a little more than that. We know from really later on in the Torah and in the Tanakh, and for sure the Talmud, that there's a concept of a Bechor. Bechor means a firstborn son. And the firstborn has a certain stature in Judaism, both from a monetary standpoint, from an inheritance standpoint, and quite often also in a socio-political standpoint. And for example, we see that when there was a king in Israel, and specifically the house of David, which was a dynasty, it was a dynastical rule. The right of first refusal, at least, or the assumption always was that it was going to be the oldest son. Now we see quite often it wasn't the oldest son, but that usually took a prophet coming in to say, by the way, it's not going to be the oldest son, it's going to be this son. So there's a status of Bechor that plays into, a bunch of different places in Judaism, and we'll talk about it a couple different times in a couple different sessions on how it plays in. But at this point, you have to remember, we're still in the proto-Jew. We're still in the time of the proto-Jew, the Jewish people being developed, of us coming into being a people, and the Torah has not been given yet. So the concept of Bechor, of firstborn, is still being written to a certain extent. And Jacob, we see, either through prophetic knowledge or just through his own understanding of the situation, essentially develops a situation where the Bechor is split up. And we see this not so much at this point in the story, but for sure at the end of the story, meaning when Jacob passes away and the blessings that he gives each of the sons. Now, technically on paper, who is the Bechor? Who is the firstborn? That would be Reuven. Right? Reuven is the firstborn son, born to Leah. It would seem that, like, hands down, Reuven is the Bechor of the Jewish people, is the firstborn of, and that seems to be the case. But no, our sages tell us Reuven is disqualified, because when a certain situation happens, if you look at the verses, it sounds like one thing happened. Our sages tell us it was something maybe a little bit different, but be it as it may, there was some sort of altercation when Rachel dies, and Jacob, so to speak, seems to elevate Bilhah to be the main wife now, and Reuven to avenge his mother's honor. Makes a stink about it. We'll just say, according to the verses, it looks like he might have had some kind of interaction with Bilhah. According to our sages, it actually just he moved the bed from Bilhah's tent into his mother's tent. But be it as it may, there was something there that he got too involved and got in trouble, and that was enough to disqualify him as the Bechor. Shimon and Levi, who are sons number 2 and 3, were also disqualified because of what we just talked about. The whole situation with Shechem and the wiping out of Shechem, and when our sages add on top of that, the other battles that took place at that time, that was all Shimon and Levi's doing. And so at that, and Jacob's clearly not happy. He says they're pachas kamayim, they're crazy like water, and they're disqualified. So who's next? Right? Judah, Yehuda. And we're gonna see that Yehuda gets part of the Bechor. Now, hold your horses, because he's going to also lose it and have to earn it back. But you see that part of it goes to Yehuda and part of it goes to Yosef. Playing back to that idea we said last week about this struggle, so to speak, or this relationship between Judah and Joseph as far as the Messianic era, bringing on, are going to the land of Israel. Joseph is always there first to get rid of the evil, and then Judah's there second to put the throne of David in place, and that plays in very much here as well. So the Bechor ends up essentially that status, that firstborn status, essentially ends up split up between Joseph and Judah. And how do we see this? Judah becomes the king, right? And even Jacob, in his final blessing to the sons, it says, Lo Yasser Shevim Yehuda, that the scepter will not leave the hands of Judah, meaning the kingship's going to Judah. He says it. But we also see that before he gives the blessing to the other 11 sons, that he gives a special blessing to the 2 sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And he says Ephraim and Manasseh should be counted to be like Reuven and Shimon, right? They should have the status of being one of the tribes. Now, what does that mean? That's what we call our Pishnayim, that in a halachic sense, the firstborn son always gets a double portion and inheritance. Now, why that is, a discussion for a different time, but just take at face value for now. That's discussed heavily in the Talmud, especially in the civil sections of the Talmud, that the firstborn gets a double portion. In other words, if there are 3 children, the estate after the passing of the parents is divided into 4. The firstborn gets 2, and the other children each get 1. And we see that manifested for the first time here, where Joseph gets that status of being a firstborn, and therefore both Ephraim and Manasseh, his 2 sons, are elevated like Reuven and Shimon and are now part of the 12 tribes, so to speak. So what that means practically is, by the way, when we count our 12 tribes and talk about the 12 tribes, we have a couple of different ways of talking about that. Because if we're counting the sons of Jacob / brothers, there's 12 of them. But if you count Manasseh and Ephraim as one each, that sounds like there's 13. You'll never see a counting that includes both Manasseh and Ephraim and Levi, right? Why? And we're getting a little bit too inside baseball here, so move on in a moment. So if I've lost you, just hang on for 30 more seconds, then we're going to move on. Levi comes into his role later. At the time of the golden calf, which we're not up to yet, we're going to see that Levi is going to be elevated and get a special status of being the priest of the Jewish people. It's not the case yet. It's only going to happen then. At that point, part of being the priest and the priestly class of the Jewish people is you have to live amongst the people. You can't live off in your own section of the country like each and every single one of the tribes do. So therefore, Levi does not get a piece of the land of Israel. They get cities spread throughout the land of Israel. And so the special status of Ephraim and Manasseh is that they get a portion of the land of Israel. So again, net result is you'll never see a list that has Ephraim and Manasseh and also has Levi. Because when we're talking about Ephraim and Manasseh with tribal status, we're essentially talking about land. We're talking about Gashmias. We're talking about physical possessions. And that level of physical possession, Levi doesn't get. So either we count Joseph and Levi, or we count Menashe and Ephraim and don't count Levi. And that's how we will always stick to 12. But be it as it may, as Joseph has this status of being a Bechor, a firstborn at some level, Jacob gives him a special coat to represent it. Now, was that smart? No. Our sages say it wasn't really a good idea, it wasn't advisable, and some of the other treatments also were not advisable. And even though at a certain point Jacob tries to sort of call out Joseph for his behaviors, we see that there were issues there, and our sages are critical of Jacob in that regard. Now, okay, so that explains Jacob's mindset and why he was treating Joseph special and Joseph better than the rest of the brothers. But what about the brothers, for crying out loud? Like we have, okay, Binyamin's obviously not here. But we have 10 of the 12 leaders of the tribes of Israel who we regard all as very righteous people. I mean, think about it. How many Reuvens do you know? How many Shimons do you know? How many Levis do you know? Like these are names that we name our children. I'm talking about Jewish names, by the way, unless you're talking about blue jeans, and then we can talk about Levi Strauss because he's named after Levi. But you know, these are our leaders of our tribes. So how are we to reconcile what they perpetrated over here? Here's how I understand it. The brothers saw a situation where Joseph was taking certain matters into his own hands. He was trying to build up his relationship with their father. And as we said before, he was giving negative reports about them to their father. And they start to become suspicious of the situation over here. They say, 1 second. And they make a calculation. We said last week that when Esav was written out of the Jewish people, that the role of Esav, the role that Esav was supposed to play, goes to the children of Rachel, most specifically Joseph. And now the brothers are looking at his behaviors. Oh, he's trying to convince father he's better. That's what Uncle Esav did. Oh, he's very concerned about the way he looks and externality and physicality and all these other things that the Torah tells us. Oh, that's just like Uncle Esav. 1 second. We've seen this movie before. The original generation, there was Avraham, and there were 2 sons, right? Yitzchak and Yishmael, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael's written off. Everything goes through Isaac. Next generation, there's 2 sons, Yaakov and Esav. Esav's written out. Everything goes through Jacob. Now in our generation, okay, there's 12 sons, but still, we have one who's trying to assert himself. And maybe he's trying to be like our father. Maybe he's trying to be like our grandfather. And maybe he thinks that it's all going to go to him and that we're going to be written out of the Jewish people. This guy is trying to wipe out 11/12 of the Jewish people before they have a chance to get off the ground even. And with this explanation, we can understand really something fascinating that our sages say. Our sages say that the brothers came together to discuss the Joseph problem, right? To figure out what to do about Joseph. And they convened a Bezdin, they convened a Jewish court with the 10 of them. And in that court, they determined that Joseph was considered a murderer. He was considered chayav misa, as we say in Hebrew, and therefore deserved the death penalty. What did he do to be considered a murderer? Like, the statement of our sages makes no sense on the surface until we have this explanation to say that they looked at his actions and felt that he was trying to write them out of the picture. And they said, therefore, we have to kill him. We have to kill him for the sake of the Jewish people, for the sake of what we're supposed to build, for the sake of what we're doing here. He's trying to get in the way of it. We must get rid of him. And they say, let's capture him, throw him in the pit, let the snakes and scorpions take care of him. At which point, Reuven, who again, remember, originally had firstborn status, had lost it, pipes up over here and he says, guys, why should we get our hands dirty with his blood? Let's just, maybe we'll like sell him into slavery. And I'm sorry, let's just throw him in the pit and we'll do, let's think about this a little bit. Now, Reuven, as the Torah tells us, has in mind that he'll be put in the pit and he'll come back later and rescue him, take him back to Jacob, reunite him with Jacob, and then they can move past this thing. That was Reuven's plan. Now, Reuven seems to go off to take care of something. And Judah, who again, remember now, has firstborn status, even though he's number 4, because of the reasons we said he has firstborn status. He says, he comes up with the idea of, 1 second, Why should we bloody our hands over here? We're considering killing him. That's beneath us. Let's just sell him into slavery. Maybe that'll humble him. And they say, you know what, Judah, you're the head of the family now, not Reuben, who said just throw him in the pit. Good idea. Let's sell him into slavery. So they see a group of Yishmaelim coming by, and they sell him to the Yishmaelim, we sell him to the Midianim. It seems like he was sold back and forth a number of times on the slave trade before he finally gets down to Egypt. Now, it's interesting. What do the brothers do right after they sell Joseph into slavery? Like, what would you do if you just sold your brother into slavery? Again, even with this understanding we've given. They sit down to have a meal because obviously after you sell someone into slavery, you got to eat. What's going on over there? Going back to this idea of our sages. Their sages said they convened a court and said that he was guilty of the death penalty. And his sentence ended up being, as opposed to being put to death, was to be sold into slavery with the hope that that would humble him and help him realize his place amongst the Jewish people that were still being built. There's a halacha that a court, a Beis Din, when dealing with a capital case, cannot eat until the case has been decided. So it makes sense that the first thing they do after they wrap up the case is sit down to eat, because that's exactly what the Talmud Sanhedrin tells us, that when our court system still existed and the Sanhedrin system still existed and capital cases happened, that the judges could not eat while the case was being determined, and only after the case was wrapped up could they, meaning the decision phase of the case, only then could they sit down and eat. And that's exactly what the brothers do. Now Reuben comes back, finds out what happened. He says, what do you mean you sold him into slavery? Right? He was like, what's going on over here? The brothers then head back to their father and they take the Ksonas Pasim. They take the that amazing Technicolor dream coat. They tear it up. They put goat's blood on it. And they say, Tati, Dad, we found this coat. Do you recognize it? And they use two Hebrew words. They said hakerna, which means, like, can you identify this? Jacob right away knew what it was. He tears his clothing in a state of mourning, and he is completely bereft. He is completely beside himself, depressed, mourning what he thinks is the loss of his beloved son, Joseph. Now, what happens next is that the brothers, looking at the situation, seeing at how their father's affected, somehow did not take that into consideration in their actions. And they say, this was a really terrible idea. And who do you think gets blamed? Judah, Yehuda. Because as we said before, Yehuda is now the head of the family. And there's a concept that, it's beautifully explained in the famous book, Good to Great, one of my favorite books by Jim Collins, where he talks about a level 5 leader. He talks about a top-notch leader. And he says one of the traits of a level 5 leader is the door-window comparison. In other words, when there's a problem, mirror window. When there's a problem, does the leader look into the mirror or does the leader look out the window? In other words, when there's a problem, does the leader look in the mirror and say, this is my fault, this is on me, this is something I did wrong, I'm taking responsibility? Or does the leader look out the window trying to push the blame to somewhere else? And Jim Collins says that the level 5 leader is the one who looks in the mirror and says, if there's a problem in the organization, it's because of me. And we see either by force of his brothers or by his own decision, that's what Judah does here. That Yehuda looks at the situation, says, basically, I was in charge. This happened on my watch. I'm taking the brunt for this. And we see that Yehuda is cast away from the family. We see that he goes down. V'yered Yehuda, the Torah says, he's kicked out of the family, at least temporarily. And we'll see how he earns not only his place back in the family, but even his place as the king of the Jewish people. Okay, we're a little over halfway point, but I do want to pause to catch any questions thus far before we jump into what happens to Yehuda when he is kicked out of the family. Let me see just in the chat box quickly what we have over here. So Ron texted here, Jacob is satisfied by circumcision as punishment for the rape of Dinah. No, Jacob did seemingly, it's a good question. In other words, Shimon and Levi seem to have good intention, that they were defending their sister's honor, defending their family's honor, and but it seems that no, Jacob is not happy with the whole situation. Again, why? What's going on there? Is it okay? Now, I'll point out one little thing over here that that in Judaism, from a Torah perspective, rape and seduction are synonymous. Okay, I want to say that one more time because that's not the case in the rest of the world. But from a Torah perspective, if a woman, God forbid, is raped, or a woman, God forbid, is seduced, it's the same thing. In other words, she's not held accountable. The person who did it is held accountable. The person who perpetrated either one of those has to make certain amends. They're synonymous. So seemingly that even though the Torah, it's unclear really if it was rape or seduction, it seems like it was probably maybe a little both, maybe more seduction, unclear. But by the fact that Dinah wanted to stay with him, we kind of deduced that it was maybe more seduction than rape. But again, in a Torah sense, it's all the same exact thing. So, but Jacob basically said, we see it first of all at the time of the story, and then later on by the blessings, he wanted nothing to do with it. Jacob felt the whole thing was wrong. Again, what would Jacob have done? WWJD, like what would Jacob have done if the brothers had come to Jacob, told him what happened? It's one of the great what ifs of Jewish history, but whatever did happen, he was not happy with. Let's see. Read Richard Dawkins debates religious issues with select others that do not know anything about Dawkins' phytobiology. He was stunned by Rabbi. Yeah, that again is a Richard Dawkins book. I'm forgetting the name of the book, but it's that book where he looks at a lot of these stories and says, "Oh, this is one of the reasons why the Bible is ridiculous, or there's no God." And interesting book, but easily I think argued against. Rabbis referenced the number of Nobel Prize by Jews. He was taken aback and had no answer. Right. Good point, Ron. Okay, Deanna has a question here. I wonder if things would have played out this way if Dinah and Joseph's souls were not switched, and Joseph's soul would have remained in the tribe of Judah and not the son of Rachel. Right. So Deanna's referencing something that Rashi tells us. Again, this is sort of a Kabbalistic idea. So a practical historical explanation I don't have, but that Leah was actually pregnant with Joseph and Rachel was pregnant with Dinah. And when Rachel was praying that she should be included amongst the matriarchs of the Jewish people, that the Almighty switched them in the wombs and put Dinah into Leah's womb and Joseph into Rachel's womb. Again, what that means historically, not sure. It's more of a Kabbalistic idea, but interesting. But an interesting thought to think about for sure. So thank you. Any other questions or comments thus far before we continue? Okay. So with no further ado, we're going to keep rocking and rolling. If you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat box or just save them till the end. Our soap opera continues. And by calling it a soap opera, it is, the next chapter in a soap opera, because we now have the story of Judah, of Yehuda. That when Yehuda is seemingly kicked out of the family, what happens? So again, I'm going to tell you the story on the surface, and you'll agree with me, it's a soap opera, and then we'll try and throw in some words of our sages to really understand what in the world must be going on over here. So Yehuda is kicked out of the family, at the time gets married to a lady whose name we don't know. We only know that she is the daughter of Shua, and they have 3 children. The 3 children they have are Er, Onan, and Shelah. By the way, if you're looking at, I'll put it in the chat box again for those of you who came in a little late, but I gave the family tree of King David before, because that is what we're actually talking about now, as you'll see as we discuss it. But I'll give it again, just in case anyone didn't get it before. Hold on 1 second here. And it's there, by the way, it's in Hebrew and in English for whatever you prefer. So we have Judah, when he goes down, marries a lady whose name we don't know, and he has 3 kids. The kids' names are Er, Onan, and Shelah. Okay, Er gets married. So again, we're probably, I don't know, probably about 15 years in. Like he gets married. Er's the oldest, probably is about 15 when he gets married, because roughly guessing that's about how old they might have been at this time. Maybe he's 20. It seems like the whole situation was 22 years. Those 22 years that Judah was kicked out. So somewhere between 13 and 22, he got married. Don't know exactly how old he was, but Er gets married to a lady named Tamar. Now, the Torah tells us that Er is not such a good guy, that he doesn't consummate the marriage, or he consummates it without consummating it. Okay, I don't want to get into the gory details, but he makes sure that Tamar will not become pregnant because he doesn't want to mar her beauty. And because of that, Er is doesn't live too long. The Almighty doesn't look at that favorably, and Er dies. Now, we see here the first concept, really, of Yibum. Now, this is before the Torah is given, but there's a concept that our sages observed the Torah even before it was given, because the Torah is the instruction book for the world. And just like if you're a master engineer, you can look at a machine and figure out how it works without an instruction book, so too our sages could look at the world and figure out, so to speak, how to use it. So they were observing the Torah even before it was given. So we see here that Yehuda takes his next son down, Onan, and performs Yibum, because Yibum is it's the concept in the Torah. It's translated as levirate marriage. Levirate is based on Latin. Julie, who's here tonight, explained it to me once in the Latin, but meaning brother marriage. But what it basically means is if a husband dies without children, that right of first refusal for his wife is to marry the next of kin, usually a brother, and that's to, she has the chance to stay in the family. She can choose to marry him or do what's called chalitza, to leave the family. But we see that Tamar marries Onan. Onan decides even though he's does the Yibum, he doesn't want to perpetrate his brother's or promote his brother's name. Again, doesn't want to have children because the children would be considered like his brothers. Again, doesn't make sure that Tamar doesn't get pregnant. The Almighty says, no good. Onan, you're knocked off too, and Onan dies. So now we have a situation where Tamar is 2 times a widow in the family of Yehuda, both from Er and from Onan, and there's a third son, Shelah. So seemingly Yibum should happen there. Yehuda on the surface says, okay, I'm gonna, let's wait till Shelah comes of age. As soon as he comes of age, I'll marry you off to Shelah. Now, there's a couple of different concepts that come into play here, but one thing that seems certain from the both open verses of the Torah and what our sages tell us is Yehuda never had any intentions of marrying off Shelah to Tamar, because he looked at, he essentially is at this point holding Tamar accountable for what happened to Er and Onan, not realizing the truth of the story that we have with our 30,000 foot view that the Torah gives us. And therefore, when Shelah comes of age, he does not give Shelah over to Tamar in marriage. Now, Tamar, we see and we know this from our sages, is a very spiritually in tune woman. And she knows through whatever level of prophecy she had that she's supposed to have a very special place in the descendants of Jacob. I'm sorry, the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Judah for that matter. And she says, what am I supposed to do here? My father-in-law is not marrying me off to Shelah. And I know that, I feel it in my bones, so to speak. In other words, I feel through the prophecy that I'm given that I'm supposed to have progeny from Yehuda and from his family. What am I to do? So after Yehuda's wife also dies seemingly young, and Tamar basically says, now's my chance. And she dresses herself up as a prostitute and sits on the way and essentially seduces Yehuda into, taking advantage of her services as what he thinks is a prostitute. Now, again, we're talking about Yehuda. Like, I have many friends named Yehuda, like many great rabbis and many great people named Yehuda. Is this just what the guy loses his wife, he's depressed, he goes to a prostitute, and we're supposed to just take that at face value? No. Our sages tell us what happened was that Yehuda's walking down the street and he sees Tamar, not knowing it's Tamar, dressed as a prostitute, sitting on the street, and keeps walking. And our sages tell us that an angel comes down and grabs him by the scuff of his neck and says, whoa, 1 second, you can't leave here because the Mashiach, Messiah, the house of David has to come from this relationship. And he, so to speak, the angel forces Yehuda to go in, which again, if you look at the verses, it says that Yehuda saw her and then he turned in. And on that, our sages say that the angel had to force him to go in because on his own, he wasn't going to do it. So sure enough, they're together. Tamar becomes pregnant. Tamar says, my fee is such and such. Yehuda says, I have no money. He says, okay, well, why don't you give me your signet ring and, your seal and your signet, and then come back tomorrow and give me my fee. Fine. He does that over. Now, again, what just talking about the crazy things here. That's like, you talk about identity theft. That was identity theft in those days, right? That was Yehuda giving over his full identity to this prostitute. So again, on the surface level, it doesn't make any sense other than that when we're talking about the lineage of Mashiach and lineage of the Davidic line, quite often the Almighty has to take over. And that's exactly what we see happening here. So Judah leaves his full identity, right? His social security number, his address, his zip code, everything with Tamar in the form of a signet ring and a seal. And he sends one of his servants the next day to try and pay her back and to get his goods back. And the servant can't find her anywhere. He asks around, no sign of such a prostitute. And he goes back and tells Yehuda, and Yehuda says, okay, then just forget it, lest this thing come to scandal, right? Which it does, because what happens is 3 months later, when Tamar starts to show, it's seen that Tamar is pregnant. Now, again, in Torah law, that at this point, she's what's considered zokuk liyibum, which means she's still connected to the family through this yibum, which has not been performed yet. But that basically means, in a halachic sense, that she's partially married still, even though her husbands are dead. But she's still considered partially married because she hasn't had chalitza, she hasn't had yibum, but she's still considered like she's married. And the fact that she become pregnant, Yehuda says, 1 second, that's adultery, right? Because it is. In a Jewish sense, in that situation, it is adultery. In other words, of a woman who did not either perform yibum, which we don't do anymore, or chalitza, which is the choice not to do yibum, and she would go and have another relationship, that's adultery in a Jewish sense. So Yehuda thinks she's guilty of adultery. That's why she's pregnant. And he seemingly is a leader in their area, wherever they are, and he has her sentenced to death. Now, Tamar, in the ultimate, really, really selfless act, when she's being walked out to be put to death, she pulls out the signet ring and the seal of Yehuda and says, oh, just by the way, before I go to my death, whomever this belongs to, that's who got me pregnant. And Yehuda right away realizes his mistake. He realizes, oh, it must not have been Tamar who was doing something wrong. It must have been my sons. And I really should have given her to Sheila, and that something is supposed to come of this relationship between Tamar and my family. And she's more righteous than me, he says. And he realizes exactly what happened. And the Torah tells us he never touched her again. It's not like they got married and had a wonderful life. No, it was a one-time thing. But the result of that is she has twins. And those twins, she has two. That's how twins work, by the way. She has two boys. One's name is Zerach and one's name is Peretz. Peretz then has a son named Chetzron. Chetzron has a son named Ram. Ram has a son named Aminadav. Aminadav has a son named Nachshon. Nachshon has a son named Salmon. Salmon has a son named Boaz. Boaz marries a lady named Ruth, who we'll get to in a couple of weeks. They have a son named Oved. Oved has a son named Jesse. Jesse has a son named David. So what ends up coming out of this relationship is none other than King David. Okay, so in that explanation, at some level, was able to shine, I hope, some light on what was going on over there, at least at some level. But I think there's a more macro question we have to discuss. And that is, okay, you justified it a little bit, Rabbi, but what's going on over here? This is the great, however many levels it was, grandfather of King David. And we say, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayom, that the house of David, the kingdom of David, will live forever, that is the ultimate kingdom of the Jewish people. And when we talk about that concept of Mashiach, of the Messiah, of the reinstitution of the house of David, we're talking about someone from this line? What? With such a soap opera? Not only that, but let's make it worse before we make it better. Because this is really the second such piece of the puzzle of the lineage of David, of the antecedents of King David that we've seen. Because if you remember from a couple sessions ago, we had the nephew of Abraham who thought the whole world was destroyed. His daughters seduce him. They become pregnant. And one of his daughters, whose name we don't know, has a son that she names Moab, which is very subtle because Moab means from my dad. In other words, the kid's name was, I am from an ancestral relationship from my dad. That was his name. And we see that Moab is going to have a descendant named Eglon. Eglon's going to have a daughter named Ruth. And that's the one we just mentioned a moment ago is going to marry Boaz to be the great-grandmother of King David. So, over here, we have Lot and his daughters. Over here, we have the situation with Yehuda and Tamar. Ruth and Boaz, we're going to see when we get there, has its question marks. And this is the antecedents of King David. Not only that, but when we fast forward from King David down to Mashiach, and he should come speedily in our days, we have many more question marks. We're going to talk about the relationship of David and Bathsheba, which is its own scandal in and of itself. And we're going to talk about the wicked Queen Athaliah, who it's a question if she was even Jewish or not. Yet she is married into the line of David. So if she wasn't Jewish, then Mashiach's not Jewish, which means she has to have been Jewish, but it's a question mark what her lineage is. Why such a crazy family as literally our king? I mean, for those of you who had a problem with Donald Trump based on his background, like listen to this, lahavdil. So I'll tell you what our sages say and the philosophers say about this. We see, and we're going to discuss this in a little bit, that before King David can, so to speak, take the throne, we have King Saul. And King Saul on paper should have been a perfect king. No skeletons in the closet at all. But we see that he was anything but a perfect king, because our sages tell us that the ideal leader has a kupa shel shrutzim, which means a basket full of rats, basically. In other words, as we would say that in a modern sense, he's got skeletons in the closet, right? Why does the ultimate leader have to have skeletons in the closet? I mean, like, let's face it, that every political race, they have, the other side's always looking to dig up all the dirt, to bring up all the illegitimate children and old girlfriends and whatever they can, old boyfriends and whatever can be found to try and spread dirt on the candidate. And we all know how it goes. The candidate has to initially deny it and then end up accepting it and have to withdraw from the race. What's going on over here? So there's a couple of things we see. David, with such a questionable pedigree, and even in his own actions, we're going to have many question marks. We see that he still is the example, the ideal example of a Jewish king. Why? Two main reasons, I believe, and probably more than two, but I'll give you two for tonight because the hour is getting late. Number one is that what does David say every time he is called out for his questionable actions? Again, this is from David forward, right? He always says the same thing. He says it to the prophet Nathan when he accuses him of doing wrong at the time of Bathsheba. And he says it numerous times in the book of Samuel, which tells the story of his life. He says straight up, he doesn't do like all the politicians I said before, where he denies, and then he ends up having to accept it and withdraw from the race. No, he says the same thing. Chatasi lashem. I sinned, I transgressed, I did the wrong thing. And he says, whatever I need to do to clean up, I'm gonna clean it up. And therefore, David becomes, and we're going to talk more about David. This is just as if it's now, but David becomes the ultimate representation of what it means that a person is never set in stone and never determined by the misdeeds they've done in the past. A person can always do tshuva. Tshuva does not mean to repent, by the way. Tshuva means to return, right? It means to return to where we were before. And we see that David sets that mold all over again. Now, where did David get that from? David got it from his great-great-great-grandfather Yehuda. Because what does Yehuda say when he's called out subtly, but still called out by Tamar? He says, I did wrong. She's more righteous than I am. And we see that after this, Yehuda comes back to the family and he's reinstated as the head of the family for his generation. Because we see, and we're going to see subsequent actions of how he deals with Joseph, not knowing that's Joseph, how he stands up to his father and works with his father, that he's going to say, oh, he got the lesson loud and clear. And we see subsequently, he teaches that lesson to his progeny, to his future generations, to say that this is how to be a Jew. So that's one understanding of why we have such a murky lineage of the house of David and the Messianic lineage. But the second is something that I often say. It's a very key part of being Jewish. And that is that Judaism is not an aristocracy, it's a meritocracy. Now, yes, there are certain aristocratic trappings, if you will. Like, for example, once King David becomes king, it's his family. That's aristocratic. Levi, or really Aaron becomes the priest. That's aristocratic. But really beyond that, those are the only two examples. Beyond that, it's a complete meritocracy. And we're going to see that the leaders of the Jewish people often come from the backgrounds similar to King David. For example, the great Rebbe Akiva, who is one of my, if you can have a favorite character in the Talmud, mine's probably Rebbe Akiva. Rebbe Akiva was the son of converts to Judaism. And we see that the great Hillel, his teachers were Shammai and Avtalyon, who themselves converted to Judaism. And the great Onkelos, whose Aramaic commentary is on the side of every single Chumash, He was a convert to Judaism, probably either the nephew or the great nephew of King Nero of Nero, the famous Roman Nero himself. Because this is one of the ideas we see from this concept of a leader always needs to have skeletons in the closet, because it doesn't matter what came before you. It doesn't matter what your pedigree is. That doesn't matter when you're Jewish. It matters what you are. It matters what you make of yourself. And that we see it better than anywhere else from the family of King David and the family of Mashiach, the Messiah himself. So, and Judah's dealing with this situation and how he dealt with that situation and taking responsibility for that situation, that was the first step in him being reinstated in his leadership role as the family. Okay, we got just a few more minutes. I want to just cover a few more topics here on our outline. We're probably gonna have to leave some of this for next week, but going back to Joseph, let's scene change back to Joseph. So Joseph is sold into slavery. Again, even the Torah tells us there's several transactions before he gets to his eventual buyer. And his buyer is none other than Potiphar, or Potipharah, as he's first introduced to us, who is the chief butcher, the Sar Tabachim he's called, which means he's the chief butcher of Pharaoh. It's some sort of, every government needs a chief butcher. Like here in America, we had the postmaster general. Potiphar was the butcher master general. That was his job. And Joseph becomes a servant in his house, a slave in his house. But we see that Joseph has this way of always ingratiating himself with whomever he comes in contact with. It's like you can't kick this guy down. It's here, you sell him in slavery, he becomes, we're going to see the head of Potiphar's house. Fortunately, then a certain situation happens that Potiphar's wife takes a liking to Joseph, tries to seduce him. Joseph stands up and doesn't act on it. The woman accuses Joseph of being the seducer, and Potiphar, even though he was really suspect his wife as the guilty culprit, he had, became a very public thing, and Joseph has to be thrown into jail. Now, parenthetically, our sages tell us that that the wife of Potiphar, through whatever witchcraft or black magic she had a connection to, saw, I don't want to call it prophetically, but saw through that she was supposed to have progeny through Joseph, because we're going to see just an interesting twist of events that it's like, I think this is where the movie Mrs. Robinson got the idea from, is that their daughter is going to end up marrying Joseph. Mm-hmm. So if you ever wondered where they got the idea from, here it is right here in the Torah. So Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of trying to seduce her. Joseph has to be thrown into jail, and Joseph becomes the top of the jail, always rising to the top. And in his interactions in the jail, there are he's thrown into some kind of royal jail, seemingly, because he was working in Potiphar's house, the chief butcher's house, and two other government officials get thrown into jail with him. None other than the Sar HaOfim, which is the chief baker, and the Sar HaMashkim, the head chamberlain, which goes to make you think a lot about Egypt in those times. Like they had a lot of government officials around the themes of food. There's probably something to say about that I'll have to think about. But because we're told about these three, and they all have to do with food. So now, just parenthetically on that, the Sar HaMashkim, the chief chamberlain, in antiquity, was really the national security advisor, because if you wanted to knock off the king or the pharaoh in this case, how did you do it? You poisoned the wine. So if you were in charge of the wine, the king's cup, that meant you were basically the national security advisor. So be it as it may, they're thrown into jail. And Joseph once again shows his dream understanding tactics and is able to correctly interpret certain dreams that they're having. The Sar HaOfim, the head baker, has unfortunately a dream with negative results, that he's going to be put to death. But the head chamberlain has a dream with positive results, that he's going to be reinstated into his position. And Joseph makes a little bit of we won't call it a fateful mistake, but a little bit of a mistake, that he tells the chief chamberlain to keep him in mind when he gets back to the court of Pharaoh. Now, our sages, again, being the great, we refer to Joseph as Yosef HaTzadik, the righteous Joseph. On his level, that was a lack of faith. And we see that he, as a certain extent, is held accountable for that, because has to spend 2 more years in jail before the head bartender actually remembers him. Now, by the way, I always say, based on this, that you see that the Sar HaMashkim, the head bartender, lives and the head baker dies. So anytime I'm in a situation where I'm asked to pour someone a drink, I'm always more than happy to do it, because we see from here that that pouring drinks for people is a sign of a long life, because the Sar HaMashkim lived. So anytime someone asks you for a drink, give it to them. Hopefully you'll live long like the Sar HaMashkim, like the head chamberlain did as well. Okay, so after 2 years, Pharaoh now has dreams, and he doesn't know what the understanding of the dreams are. And all of a sudden, now the Sar Hamashkim remembers. He comes in front of Pharaoh. He says, "Eschatani maskir yom." I have to remind you of what I did before. You remember when I was thrown into jail? When I was there, I had these dreams, and there was this Hebrew kid who knew the interpretation. All of your wise men haven't figured anything out. Maybe we should take him out of jail and see what he says about your dreams. Fine. So that's what they do. They pull Joseph out of jail. They clean him up. They give him a fancy suit and cut his hair and make him look all fancy to meet with the Pharaoh. He goes into Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells him his dream. Pharaoh interprets it was really two dreams. He had one dream of the corn stalks, the withering corn stalks eating the healthy corn stalks, and the withering cows or the weak cows eating the strong cows. And Joseph looks at this and says, "Okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have 7 years of plenty, right? And then after those 7 years of plenty, you're going to have 7 years of famine." But Yosef goes a little bit further, and he also gives Pharaoh a whole plan on how to, so to speak, deal with this situation. And the Pharaoh was so enamored with Joseph's not only dream interpretation because it was spot on, or he felt it was spot on, and so much more so than his own wise men. He said, "You're it, man. In other words, I'm not sending you back to jail. I think your interpretation is true, and you're in charge of implementing the plan you just laid out before me." And he promotes Yosef to the position of viceroy. A viceroy is one of those great terms that no one really knows what it means. It means vice royalty, meaning second to the king. In Hebrew, they call him Mishneh Lamelech, which means second to the king. And he's married to Osnas Bas Potiphera. Again, like I said before, the daughter of Potiphar, like our Mrs. Robinson situation. And he becomes the viceroy of all of Egypt, implementing this plan he had laid out for Pharaoh to store up the grain of Egypt and to prepare for this 7 years of famine. Now, before we wrap up, I'll just point out an interesting thing that our sages tell us, that seemingly everyone in Egypt at some level knew about this plan, but only Yosef's plan seems to work. In other words, whatever storage mechanisms or whatever any other person in Egypt tried to do to prepare for the 7 years of famine seemingly didn't work, because we're going to see that when the famine hits, it is only Pharaoh who seems to have grain. No one else has it. And again, a couple of different explanations and understandings of that. One is that quite simply, you can say just on a practical level, his ingenuity was better than everyone else, quite possibly. Or maybe he had the blessing of the Almighty that no one else had, so everyone else's attempt to save didn't work. Be it as it may, we're going to see that when the 7 years of famine start, that the only person in the whole entire Fertile Crescent, quote unquote, in Mesopotamia, and the whole area of that whole area of the world, the whole Levant, this isn't really the Levant, this is Egypt, but in that area of the world, the only person who's going to have any food is going to be the Pharaoh, compliments of the storehouses that Joseph put into place, and therefore the whole entire world is going to come to Pharaoh to get the food that they need and prepare and to sustain themselves during these years of famine. Okay, I know we have more on the outline there, but I think we're going to save it till next time because we are already over time. But I do want to thank you all for coming and thank you for listening. And just with no further ado, if anyone else has questions, I see there's a few things in the chat box here, and we'll hit those first. So Julie asked who was related to Nero, and Deanne answered. Thank you, Deanne. That if you look in a traditional chumash, here, I'll got one here. Just get a nice art scroll here, and let's see if I can focus in the camera where you can see it. So this over here is the main text of the Torah. This over here is what's called, let's see if we can get the camera to focus, what's called the Targum Onkelos, meaning the translation of Onkelos. It's an Aramaic translation of the Torah, and the person who translated is someone that we know as Onkelos Hager, in other words, Onkelos the convert. And according to the Talmud, he was the nephew or great nephew of Nero, of the Emperor Nero, who we'll get to when we talk about the Romans. So it just goes to show you how just these converts at the times of the Romans, how many you had and how aristocratic they are and how high the high levels they reached in a Jewish sense. And again, talk about more when we get to the Romans. Thank you, Deanne, and thank you all for the messages on the class. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Anyone, you can also feel free to put your questions in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask any questions, I'll stay as long as people have what to say. Got a few people still hanging out. Any more questions before we wrap it up? Okay, so I just want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for listening. And next week we will pick up with the story of the brothers and Jacob and everyone coming down to Egypt. And stay tuned for when we switch. And again, as I said at the beginning of the class, when anyone came late, it is looking like Wednesday is going to be our only option to move this class to, but please give me feedback because I know a few people already did voice that it was not good for them. So if it really does end up being a lot of people, we're going to have to figure something out. So please give me your feedback on that if you haven't already. And I wish you all a great week, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.